little bit of a sobering day, but don't worry, at the end, I will build you back up. I will end it in hope, because I think there's a lot of hope. But as we navigate the churches during COVID, there's some troubling statistics, and I've been reading a lot about the state of the church right now, because I think it's important for us to put our finger on the pulse of the church and what's going on in the church. I think for too long the church has been neglected, and we've been kind of, just generally speaking, we've been painting this facade and making the outside look really nice. We've built really nice church buildings. We've sunk tons and tons and tons of money into church buildings while we've taken that same money that's available away from missionaries. A lot of our missionaries have been left high and dry. I personally know missionaries who've been pulled out of the mission field because the mission budgets were stripped from churches. This has been going on for quite a while. And so I've been kind of reading a lot of articles coming out of both the Barna Group. They're about as reputable as you can get. And also Thom Rainer, who does a lot on church trends. Thom Rainer's been writing and speaking a lot about this. So today I want to talk about trends in churches. What's going on right now, and what does that look like in the next few months or few years? This year's theme is revival. So obviously I'm not going to preach a sermon and say the church is crashing and burning and there's nothing we can do about it, because I don't believe that. I believe there are some very real problems. I think there are some very troubling trends, and I think that it's going to force us to do something about it. We're going to be forced to do something about it. So let's look at some of the trends. This was a podcast that Thom Rainer had this last week. I listened to the podcast. It was like a 15-minute podcast, and it was pretty eye-opening. This is based on a lot of his research over the last few months, and it's titled 5 Reasons Why the Speed of Change Must Accelerate in Your Church in the Post-Quarantine Era. So what he's saying is that we need to stop resisting change. A lot of churches are really resistant to change, and they'll say things like, well, this has always worked for us, or that's the way we've always done things, or things of that nature. Thom Rainer says, no, you've got to accelerate the rate of change in your church in the post-quarantine era, because things are changing so rapidly because of the coronavirus, because of the pandemic. So here are his 5 points. Number one, reason we need to accelerate change: COVID accelerated negative change in your church by 3 to 5 years. Now, what he means by that is not that COVID has created negative change in our churches, but that it accelerated it. So any problems that were underlying problems within churches, with volunteer burnout, that's a problem that I think the vast majority of churches face. Attendance that's in decline. People who are, once a month, once every 2 months in attendance. They actually said in the podcast, they said those people are now gone. Statistics are showing that people who show up in attendance every now and then, periodically, they're not coming back in the post-COVID era. He says that we declared attendance decline as the issue prior to the quarantine era. So church decline, if they could boil that down and say this is the one issue that the church faces that we've got to really hone in on, it's church attendance being in decline. That's the one issue. This has been accelerated by 3 to 5 years. So in other words, at the rate of what it would take for those people who are kind of on the fence to leave in 1 year, that's been accelerated by 3 to 5. So you have massive exodus from the church right now. Number two, if leaders don't increase the speed of change, inward-focused churches will become extremely inward-focused. So if you're focused on taking care of your own church and not reaching the lost, if that was the case before COVID, that's going to really be the case now. Evangelism is not even going to be on the radar. Reaching the lost is not going to be on the radar. Next point, the third point, churches that are not conversion growth churches will die very soon. What he means by conversion growth churches are not what my friend Matt Dabbs calls shuffling the saved, because that's what we do, right? We tend to shuffle the saved. We start up a new church when we get mad at the other church. We call it a church plant, but we don't genuinely grow the church from unchurched people. And so people at church A will leave when church B opens its doors, so we shuffle the saved. Conversion growth churches, on the other hand, are churches that are true conversions. People who are unchurched, who come to Christ. We teach them about Christ. We're active in evangelism, and we grow the churches authentically through conversions. The churches that are not conversion growth churches will die very soon. In fact, the Barna Institute put a very recent study out, I think within the last month. Barna says that 1 in 5 churches could close in the next, listen to this, in the next 18 months. Think about that. Wrap your head around that number. In 18 months, if you drive through Somerset and count the churches, every 5 churches, one of those churches is going to close its doors in 18 months. And that's being replicated no matter how big or how small the churches are. Size doesn't matter anymore. Mega churches are closing their doors at unprecedented rates. 1 in 5 churches will likely close their doors in the next 18 months across this nation. So he says in this point, we need to be very intentionally outward focused, and we need to rethink how we use our facilities. We should use our facilities in a way to reach the community. Point number 4, I mentioned this, I think, last week. Your pastor may leave. Thom Rainer is finding very troubling statistics showing that a lot of preachers are actively leaving the pulpit right now, and a lot of them are on the fence right now. There's an extreme shortage of ministers across all denominations right now. So he says they're either being fired or they're ready to quit. He says there's a lot of finger pointing in the nation right now, and the idea to get rid of the leader and replace that leader with someone new is appealing to churches. So in other words, they're pointing the blame at the church decline. Churches are feeling the stress of the church decline, and they're pointing to the preacher usually and saying, this guy's got to go, we'll replace him with somebody new, get new blood in here, and that'll spark the church back up and it'll revive. Thom Rainer says, not so fast. He says that there are underlying problems that have been festering for a long time. He's been writing about it and talking about it for decades, and the church has not been paying attention. And now during COVID, these problems are all coming to the surface at breakneck speed. So he says the message to these leaders are, you can't make big changes, but we want you to perform. The churches are telling the preachers, we don't want any changes here, but you need to step into action. You need to step up to the plate, work more hours, get this church growing again. And he says it's not going to work. The message is fix this, but don't change anything. And then the last point, the 5th point, is that we need to get out of our comfort zone and reach people beyond ourselves. And he says, I call this the Acts 1:8 and the Acts 8:1 moment. So, what does Acts 1:8 say? We just read from that a little bit ago. I have it underlined, part of verse 8 underlined. So when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom of Israel? He said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, 2 men stood by them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? I love that question. They're in awe. They're fascinated. They just watched Jesus go up to heaven, and the angels are coming up beside them, and they're like, what are you guys looking at? Why are you standing around is a better translation. Why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. And then Acts chapter 8:1, this is the persecution. And when persecution came, the church just exploded. And Thom Rainer argues, not only are we probably going to enter into a season of some form of persecution, but we need to enter into a season of persecution to force people to go out and share the gospel. Acts 8:1 says, and Saul approved of his execution, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. See, Jerusalem had become this little comfort zone for the Christians. It was the center of worship, and people were stuck there, and they were like, okay, Jesus, he's ascended, and now we're just going to preach in Jerusalem, and we're going to all have this utopia, and we're going to start this church, and we're going to grow it in Jerusalem, and it's going to be magnificent. And what does Jesus say? You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Now get going. You know, it's interesting. The disciples didn't get going, did they? And then persecution hit, and they were forced out of Jerusalem. They were forced to go elsewhere. Christians were scattered. And Rainer's saying that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is what happened. We have to be forced out of our comfort zones. And I don't want this to be a sermon where I'm just talking and I'm like, yeah, you know, we need to change. You know, someday down the road. Guys, we need to be out there right now talking to lost people about Jesus Christ, and we're not doing it. We're not doing it. This, by definition, is an inward-focused church. This is our wake-up call. So, where's the hope in that? Where's the good news? The good news is that there are people who are stepping out. One of those people is a good friend of mine, Matt Dabbs. Matt just made an announcement this last week, and if you've seen the Jesus 101 study, or if you've been through the Jesus 101 study, Matt Dabbs was one of the authors of that. Matt had a nice cushy job at a good-sized church in Alabama. Matt just stepped down, and he's transitioning out. He left on very good terms, but he's transitioning out because his county in Alabama is the most unchurched county in Alabama. Alabama has like an 84% rate of Christians across the state. His county is one of the most unchurched, or is the most unchurched in the whole state of Alabama. So Matt has been really wrestling with this idea of discipleship. And both him and his wife, Missy, went out, and they have different degrees and backgrounds in discipleship training. So they decided to start a church to kind of help with the COVID regulations and all that stuff. They started church in their backyard and found it to be hugely successful. That it was highly engaging, that people were actually talking to each other and with each other. Some of the superficial things that come with corporate religion went away. And so Matt and Missy decided that they were going to plant an outward-focused church from their backyard called Backyard Church. And the idea is not just to start another church in town so that they can shuffle the saved. The idea is for that church to be a church-planting church. And they're going to start planting other churches in their town and train people to teach and to preach so that they can replicate that model and start planting churches specifically to reach the unchurched people. And you know what scripture Matt based it on? Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. Verse that's in front of you right now. Another good friend of mine, good friend of mine and Natalie's, Matthew Wright. He's been here before. He's visited, him and his wife Colleen. It's been a few years. But if you remember, he was the Apache pilot. He led singing when he was here. Same kind of story. Matt's dad is a preacher at a good-sized church, also in Alabama. And during COVID, they had a lot of restrictions. So they started doing church in their home just so that they could have a smaller, more intimate group. And it worked well. And so they made the painful decision to inform the elders of the church that they were withdrawing membership, and they were going to plant this church specifically to reach unchurched people. So Matt's been calling me. He tries to call. Well, he does call. I try to answer when he calls. He calls me once a month, and he says, I just want to get some feedback and tell you about some of the things that we're doing and hear your thoughts on it. And it's been an exciting process for me because I'm seeing that there's authentic growth in the church when we step out of our comfort zones. By the way, none of these people had like this tremendous support and were like, yeah, we're just going to go do this and we have financial backing and we're going to go out and do it. That's not the case. I think Matt and Missy are probably a little bit scared to death. He went from a really cushy job as a full-time paid preacher to now they're stepping out in faith and they're starting this church with nothing. That's a huge leap of faith. But it's exciting because these guys are reaching unchurched people that they weren't reaching at their big churches. They had these big churches that were stuffed full of people, but they were not reaching the lost. And now you have 2 house churches in Alabama from people who I know personally, and there are going to be more of these that are cropping up out of necessity. And these guys are planting these churches with a very specific mission to reach the unchurched. They're evangelizing. I think that's really incredible. So my message to us is that I'm not saying we got to, pluck up out of here and start planting house churches in town, but we've got to start reaching the lost. We're an aging congregation. If you look around the room, we're aging, all of us. And if we're not reproducing, the family will die out. We've got to actively be reaching the lost. We've got to be intentional about it. We've got to work together to do it. And I think that COVID is going to force a lot of us to do it. Maybe not now, maybe not in the next year, but very soon we're going to be forced to step out of our comfort zones and to reach the lost. So I want to encourage you with that. This is not depressing, and I'm not, wagging my finger at anybody here. It's just a reality of what is. This is where we're at. And all the best researchers out there are showing these trends, and they're really alarming trends. And that includes in the churches of Christ. We've had some recent studies in the churches of Christ. We're in a spiraling decline. It is rapid. So, we need to go out and we need to live out Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. We need to reach the lost, we need to be intentional, and we need to remember that God will bless us. That was a promise. God didn't say, well, if you go out, good luck, it might work, cross your fingers. God says He will bless us. God will multiply the church. God will multiply the rate at which people are being transformed through Jesus Christ. That's exciting. So I think, if anything, we're living in exciting times where people are actively going out. My friend Matt is not a preacher. He's not a trained preacher. He served in the military for years, and now he works for the military. I won't say what he does, because it's probably covert. But it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool stuff. He's not a trained preacher, but he's preaching every single week. And he'll call me and run ideas by me, and I think usually watches our live stream. They do their service in the afternoon so that people who work in the morning are able to come in the afternoon. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, and it's going to be a really positive thing for the kingdom. If there's anybody this morning who's not yet taken that step to put Christ on a baptism, or anybody who has prayer needs, I would encourage you to come up. Or our shepherds will be in the back as we all stand and sing together.